Good evening. We will now get started with the evening's program. Thank you for joining us as we host another installment of the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, sponsored by the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. My name is Haun Saussy, and I am University Professor in the Departments of Comparative Literature and East Asian Languages and Civilizations and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. For more information on the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies and the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, please visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. These links will be provided in the chat box. All you have to do is click. Tonight's program is co-sponsored with the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, the Center's long-term partner and first not-for-profit bookstores. Their mission is simply bookselling. We're encouraging book sales for this event to be made through the Seminary Co-op, and although the stores remain closed to the public, alas, they are fulfilling orders through their website. We encourage you to visit their website and help support this unique cultural institution and important part of the Hyde Park landscape. You may learn more about the Seminary Co-op by following the link now being provided in the chat box. A link to purchase tonight's book will also be made available in the chat box. So we'll start with a presentation, and it will be followed by a question and answer session. You're welcome, in fact, encouraged to ask questions. To do so, simply type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get them ferried onto the speakers. I want, before we get much farther along, to introduce briefly our two guest speakers. Alexa Alice Joubin is Professor of English, Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, Theater, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Cultures at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she is the founding co-director of the Digital Humanities Institute. I'm proud to say that I was among her teachers when she took her PhD at Stanford, and it has been a real pleasure to watch her rise in the world. She is the author of Shakespeare and East Asia, Oxford University Press 2021, the book we're talking about tonight. The co-author with Martin Orkin of Race from Routledge in 2018, the editor-in-chief of the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Global Shakespeare, and the co-editor of Local and Global Myths in Shakespearean Performance from 2018, and finally, Shakespeare and the Ethics of Appropriation, also from Palgrave, 2014. Her interlocutor tonight will be Professor Michael Saenger. Michael Saenger, whose PhD is from the University of Toronto, is Associate Professor of English at Southwestern University. He teaches and writes on Shakespeare from a wide variety of perspectives. He's the author of two books, The Commodification of Textual Engagements in the English Renaissance from Ashgate in 26, and Shakespeare and the French Borders of English, Palgrave Macmillan, 2013. And he's the editor of Interlinguicity, Internationality, and Shakespeare from McGill Queen's University Press in 2014, as well as numerous articles on Renaissance and other literature. He publishes blog entries for the Times of Israel and has spoken internationally on Shakespeare and translation. This interest in multilinguicity makes him a particularly appropriate interlocutor for Alexa this evening. One of Alexa's many agendas has been to denationalize Shakespeare and resituate him in the widest possible variety of contexts. So I will just hand over the proceedings to Alexa. And what we should do, I believe, is invite Alexa to give a brief presentation of the book. Your copy is much bigger than mine, it looks like. Wow, how did you get them to do that? and then Michael will provide commentary, ask questions, we'll have a bit of dialogue, and I'll let you know when it's time to start taking questions from the audience, if you don't mind. All right, but first, Alexa, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Haun, for the generous introduction. Thank you for sharing. I feel really so privileged. to be at this event chaired by you after our time at Stanford. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by an Asian name would smell as sweet or not. Well, the play Romeo and Juliet is propelled by the generation-old dispute between the aristocratic Montague and the Capulet. The film Chicken Rice War reduces the feud to the rivalry between the Wang and Chan families, as you can see behind me here. I am hoping that can be spotlighted so that you can see it better. And these stall owners, they own competing chicken rice stalls next to each other in an open-air food court in Singapore. No blood is spelled other than that of poetry. Languages and accents are important markers of racial identities in this multilingual film. Just like race, gender roles take on new meanings as well. An example is Twelfth Night. Again, you see the 12th Night behind me. Viola, disguised as page boy, Cesario. She's pursued by the lovelorn Olivia. When Viola declares that I am the man, she will better love a dream. She speaks with double irony as a doubly cross-dressed boy actor on the all-male early modern English stage, such as Nathan Field, one of the famous historical boy actors. But here, as you can see behind me, this is an all-female Japanese musical production, and the genre is known as Takarazuka. Viola embodies a new form of gender fluidity here. In Kimura Shinji's 1999 production, Viola was actually played by an otakoyaku, or an actress specializing in presenting sensitive masculinity of idealized male characters. These are but some of the examples of what I have discovered on my journey. And I am going to shift now to the slides to continue our journey. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to Haun Saussy and to my discussant tonight. In writing the book, my goal is to expand the purview of post-colonial studies, which tends to focus on more privileged British colonialism and Anglophone colonies, countries that do not fully align with the narrowly defined colonial experience, such as Korea and Japan, have been neglected. I decolonized the study of non-Western cultures and of the Western canon. It is racist, I believe, to regard non-Western films as merely footnotes to the white canon. My research reveals deep connections among cultures. Since the 19th century, in fact, stage and film directors have mounted hundreds of adaptations of Shakespeare drawn on East Asian motifs. And all these works do not always originate from East Asia. By the late 20th century, Shakespeare had become one of the most frequently performed playwrights in East Asia. There are 5 fascinating aspects of this phenomenon, from gender, race, to transgender characters, to the deep level connections across different genres. Gender pronouns are really important. Word choices in East Asian films and productions, they can reveal or conceal how much power a character might have over others. In Akira Kurosawa's film Throne of Blood, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth address each other with formal and informal gender pronouns that betray their unease and desire for control. What stands out in the film is how and when some characters choose for informal language. When conversing with each other, Macbeth and Banquo refer to each other with first names, deepen their voice, and use informal language and the informal masculine I, ore. Macbeth attempts to create a similarly intimate bond with his wife in private, but she rejects his attempts and maintains verbal and physical distance. It is notable that when Macbeth addresses Lady Asaji, he does not use any honorific. He does not address her as Suma, wife, or Okusan, lady of the house. Meanwhile, Asaji uses the most formal singular first-person pronoun, watakushi, rather than the informal feminine atashi, which would be what the private conversation between a husband and a wife normally entails. Lady Asaji's combination of the formal watakushi and usually more casual anata, the latter here spoken in a register that conveys condescension and rejects intimacy, creates a layer of the uncanny beyond the atonal music. In the Takarazuka musical I mentioned earlier, Viola Cesario was not the only cross-dressing character. Gendered pronouns are especially fraught in this all-female production with many layers of disguise. The Japanese language often elides the subject, in addition to making the right choice of employing the familiar and the polite register. Based on the relation between the speaker and the addressee, male and female speakers of Japanese are restricted by the gender-specific first-person pronouns available to them. In short, gender code switching creates semantic ambiguity and double irony. Syntactical limitations actually create linguistic and cultural opportunities in articulating anew, for example, Orsino's comments about love from a masculinist perspective, or Viola's apology for a woman's love when in disguise. And as I'll reveal later, some of these, especially in film, some of these layers are disguised by subtitles. Subtitles are simultaneously heuristic, but also they often gloss over some of these issues. So the second aspect is social reparation, reparative uses of Shakespeare. Now, does Shakespeare always come to rescue? Not always. Some adaptations offer a corrective to Shakespeare's plays, such as Sherwood Hu's film Prince of the Himalayas. As you can see here, this is Ophelia, shot and filmed in Tibet with a Tibetan cast speaking Tibetan. The film gives Ophelia a more active role through a remedial view of the dramatic action, whereas Shakespeare's Gertrude's account of Ophelia recast her as a, quote, mermaid-like fairy tale creature. The Ophelia here in this film is a goddess of nature, an immortal bride who returns to nature. She gives birth to Hamlet and her baby here in the Namso Lake, which is a sacred site. The scene here pays tribute actually to pre-Raphaelite painter Sir John Everett Millet's famous painting, Ophelia. Other works mock the conviction that Shakespeare has any recuperative function in the society, such as the Hong Kong comedy film One Husband Too Many, directed by Anthony Chan. This is from 1988. We'll see a short clip in a minute. The canonical status of Shakespeare's oeuvre has led to admiration and deference, but there has been many witty parodies like this one. Since the 1980s, the film dramatizes its characters' near quixotic insistence on performing and rehearsing Romeo and Juliet to ameliorate their conditions. Shin pins all his hope on bringing Western culture to a backwater village by staging his version of Romeo and Juliet with the costumes and the soundtrack borrowed from Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 film. He takes on the role of Romeo, his wife plays Juliet. Everything goes wrong, unfortunately.
是咧创啥哈？大概是想要放就放袂出来，徛尾啦。
神啊！你已夺去他冰糖一样的呼吸，他的体温，他的美貌，他的笑容。话题在涌，月照泪影，情不在心，万般无情，面对绝境，心痛莫名，我独留名，命必凋谢。
丢你个头啊！
陪你，我愿到阴间当壮丁。神啊！
我仍然在黑布袋一般的地狱吗？冰冻的 罗密欧啊，你要我脱下这贵族的丑恶外衣，温暖你的胸膛吗？
有好戏看嘞！
你为我而殉情，我该怎么办？我该怎么办呢？
关键办他了，办掉了，快点点，办掉了，办掉了！
Shall we say we just have a tad bit too much audience participation. The couples persist after going backstage, then return, trying to finish, however, trying to complete the scene, but the audience would not afford them the luxury of closure.
哦，罗密欧，你为我而殉情，我该怎么办？我该怎么办？
办他了，办他了！谁说办他？我办谁？谁敢再吵我扁谁？阿志，是不是你在吵啊？抓到，赶紧别接落来！阿高，慢点干净啊！干净啊！拍手，不拍倒腿，拍，不准拍！是阿才，你当我是阿才，这不是你气笑的所在啦！刘大便，你是不给80公面子！刘大便，刘大便是你叫的，你还要一小便呢？好。不要这样嘛！现在演的是罗密欧与朱丽叶，又不是演仙桃牌通鲁丸对四五丸。我只是想把。
The disruptive audience eventually prevents the play from continuing, and yet they bring an uncanny understanding of Romeo and Juliet to the scene. After all, this is an extremely violent play about gang violence. From here, we're going to move on to the next theme, the third theme, which is actually transgender performance, cutting edge. In the late 1990s, to help change the image of South Korea abroad, the government began sponsoring the productions of films and theater works. Within the context of the democratization of the country, several South Korean adaptations of Hamlet, for example, recast Ophelia as a shaman, who serves as a medium to console the dead and guide the living, because female shamans exist outside the Confucian social structure. They have greater agency. Inspired by political and academic feminism, these works reflect the position of Korean women in the society. Although Ophelia has been appropriated as a feminist symbol, she is also a site of contestation over gender identities. The 2005 South Korean feature film, The King and the Clown, depicts the erotic entanglement among a king and two acrobat street performers. So you can see on the slide here, the king on the upper left with the macho performer, Jang Song, on the upper right, who plays male roles, and the trans feminine Gong Ji, who shares several personality traits with Hamlet's love interest, Ophelia. They are located at the lower left. And eventually, a jealous courtesan on the lower right, on the screen here, who intervenes in this triangle relationship. Both Ophelia and Gongji, or our trans Ophelia, they are unable to express themselves, and their life is largely determined by men around them. The transgender Ophelia character draws on the local culture of flower boys. The term flower boy refers to male identifying singer or actor known for their use of makeup and mannerisms that are considered socially to be feminine. Female fans live vicariously through androgynous characters without fear of being stigmatized as being promiscuous. The desire and sexuality of the female fans are complex. The fans may have lesbian tendencies, or they may be desiring ideal heterosexual men who rarely exist in reality. As seen in the core, there is diagnostic significance regarding Ophelia's trans femininity. And here I'm showing you a few shots from earlier part of the film. You can see Gongji, the trans Ophelia, performing on a tightrope. And in this instance, she has her mask lifted above her head. And the film was actually a box office hit. It surpassed even the box office record of the Titanic in South Korea. This is another example of queer films that fly under the radar. So in the court is on Notsu, shown in the middle here. She storms in on the king and Ophelia in an intimate moment and taunts Ophelia about their quote-unquote real gender. The scene points to voyeuristic desires anchored in anatomy as an index to some truth about gender. Notsu tries to undress Ophelia in front of the king, creating a great deal of tension. Presumably, her dramatic act of gender revelation is to expose Ophelia as an abject subject with alleged physical deficiencies, and thereby dissuade the king from bestowing further favors on Ophelia. She does not succeed. Such revelation scenes are a familiar device in transgender films, a device of exposure that subjects trans character to extra scrutiny. Such cinematic shock devices enact struggles over the body's meanings. And I single out that example because it's so unusual to have a mainstream transgender film. It was often misunderstood, misread as a homonormative film, as a gay film. Even though it has a trans Ophelia at the center. So we shall proceed now to the fourth key thing, which is racial differences and how characters and even theater goers, film goers hear or not hear race. Race and ethnicity are not only visible, but of course audible in many instances. In the multilingual film, the Singaporean film Chicken Rice War that I mentioned earlier, for example, there are a number of important accents and languages being deployed to signal the differences between the generations, between the two houses, built around the conceit of a college production of Romeo and Juliet. The film uses multilingualism as both a dramatic device and a political metaphor. The elder generation converses in Cantonese, while the younger generation speaks mostly Singlish or Singaporean English. Fenson and Audrey, in a mix of English and Cantonese, perform the balcony scene, for example, in which Romeo and Juliet meet after the masked ball. Meanwhile, their offstage parents, and here is the boy's father, the girl's father, actually. Their offstage parents, they became more and more impatient with the public display of affection during the production. They're unable to distinguish, just like the Hong Kong film One Husband Too Many that we've seen. Here you have audiences within the film who cannot distinguish the spaces between playgoing versus playmaking. So they disrupt the boundary between playmaking and playgoing and intrude into the space. What's interesting is that Singapore's propaganda emphasizes commercial cosmopolitanism and transnational histories of immigration in the service of economic growth. Chicken Rice War critiques the idea that sounding white, speaking standard English, for example, sounding white would convey more authority, and that's really what the film is critiquing. We have arrived at our final theme, the deep connections. There are deep connections among Asian and Anglophone performance cultures. Chicken Rice War pointedly parodies Baz Luhrmann's campy film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And Luhrmann's film, as you can see here, opens with a composed, dispassionate, deliberately old-fashioned script reading by a female TV news anchor, framed by an antiquated television set. This is followed by the voice of a male announcer in a solemn tone against live action shots and an operatic track. In Chicken Rice War, the reflexive role of the chorus is split among the English-speaking newscaster, as we see here, who opens the film, and the Malay character who sings a version of the prologue as Cantonese opera at her beverage stall.
Two families, both alike in dignity and profession, in fair Ang Mo Kio, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge bred to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers choose their chicken rice.
What are you saying? Do you think Mr. Tan and Amokyo can understand you? When I told you not to speak in Singlish, I didn't ask you to sound like Shakespeare. Do it again. Do it again.
The son and daughter of these families, they are staging Romeo and Juliet in college, and here is a specific reference to DiCaprio.
Mr. Pillay, may I be so bold as to ask for a chance to read Romeo?
What makes you think that you can be Romeo?
What makes you think you can play Romeo?
Very expensive.
On the other hand, he looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. That's why he's Romeo. Do you think you look like Leonardo?
Yeah, I agree.
So as you can see, that is a deliberate reference to Baz Luhrmann's film. This Singaporean film came out in 2000 on the heel of Luhrmann's feature film, Romeo plus Juliet. Further, as we've seen earlier in the film clip, One Husband Too Many features costumes reminiscent of Danilo Donati's doublet and tights designs for Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, to the tune of that film's A Time for Us by Nino Rota, with new Cantonese lyrics. There are many other examples. For example, and this is a quick comparison of how the Hong Kong film, the campy Hong Kong film responds to, incorporates and parodies Franco Zeffirelli. This is Michael Amarita in his film Hamlet, set in 2000, with Buddhist inflection. He features in the to be or not to be scene the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who's on a television screen in Hamlet's studio. Hamlet's toying with a handgun, pointing the gun at his head. And there's a spin-off of the to be or not to be speech. The lecture here being that to be or not to be is not a question. What we need to contemplate is how to intervene with parents, with communities, with nature, and so on. Now, what do all these deep connections tell us? There are deep connections among adaptations that extend through media and genres. Several works examined here are products of meta-cinematic and meta-theatrical operations. Akira Kurosawa used traditional Japanese theatrical elements in his film of Macbeth. His signature long shots, for example, remains emotionally detached, and those shots are echoed in the director Yukio Ninagawa's stage production. Multilingual films such as Chicken Rice War counter the narrative about universal literary experiences that compel us to work with rather than work out of the space between languages. And I always find it really productive to work with the space between languages, that interstitial space. I have also looked at how subtitles can, on one hand, erase difference, and on the other hand, recognize difference with an eye toward equality. There are deep connections among adaptations from different cultures. Appreciating these connections help us transcend what I call compulsory realpolitik, the conviction that the best way to understand non-Western works is by interpreting their engagement with pragmatic politics. This approach may imply that non-Western works are of interest solely because of the testimonial value. It tends to characterize a non-Western artwork based on stereotypes of the nation of origin. For example, South Korean performances are sometimes seen as political allegories of the post-war tensions on the Korean peninsula. Compulsory realpolitik could imply that works from the or Asia are valuable only for their political messages rather than their aesthetic merits. The assumption leads to research questions driven by polity. For example, somebody asked, why are there so many global Shakespeare adaptations in cultures with no love for Great Britain? The implication is you must first love Great Britain, maybe the British government, before you would love Shakespeare. Anglophone Shakespeares are assumed, therefore, to have broad theoretical applicability and aesthetic merits, whereas foreign performances, even when they focus on artistic innovation or on a personal rather than epic scale, are compelled to prove their political worth. Critics are on the lookout for potentially subversive political messages in these works, which are compulsorily characterized as allegories of geopolitical issues. And so, as you see on the screen here, works by non-white authors are sometimes imagined to fix their intellectual content by way of a national or racial location. Western white examples are assumed to be more effective in their explanatory power, while African, Asian, and Latin American materials are recruited to serve as the exceptional particular. Asian Shakespeares give us a category that we can use to develop a site-specific critical vocabulary to address the blind spots created by compulsory realpolitik. The story of Asian performances is not and should not always be political. Stories of political oppression, of course, must be told, but dichotomized views do not get us very far. Cross-cultural adaptations promote self-reflexivity on social and personal levels. The self-reflexivity promotes the awareness of the theatricalization of difference. The performances are therefore productive in the sense that they are generative. They engender evolving ideas of Western canon, of Asian modes of expression, and so on. Adaptations are energized by internal divisions, but also pathways. Adaptations are therefore the prodigal child that ultimately expands the riches of human civilization. And I would like to conclude a photo of our pandemic puppy giving my new book a sniff. So far, it's been up to sniff, though he fell asleep after 5 minutes. I'm going to stop here and have my discussant, Professor Michael Saenger, join us.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Alexa for inviting me to respond to this wonderful talk based on a much more wonderful book. I want to thank Connie for arranging the event and also Han for hosting it. It is possible to posit a model of Shakespeare as a native English creator, a wondrous maker of Vedic works that command the admiration and imitation of the world. The image of such a singular creator has been persistent, arguably since the publication of his folio works in 1623, but certainly for the British Romantic poets, who saw in Shakespeare a wild, authentic, and profound visionary whose poetry fortified the spirit of mankind. But of course, that model is not true. While it is useful, well, it was useful for the British Empire to conjure a hero to personify England's greatness, and useful for America to conjure a Shakespeare, a model of self-reliance and ingenuity. These portraits elide the time and particularity of Shakespeare's life. Not to mention, they also run aground of current justified political changes. Shakespeare navigated many languages and eagerly accepted opportunities to retell and reframe older stories in distinctive ways. In fact, he frequently shifted between different dialects of English and developed a style while in continuous relationship with other authors, many of whom left us no text to read. And while he seems clearly to have been loyal to the two monarchs who ruled England during his lifetime, as well as to the nation itself, his writing shows almost no interest in patriotism. his most celebrated paean to the sceptered Isle of Britain sounds like undiluted praise only if it is excised from its context, which frames it clearly as a pained diatribe on royal failure. Since Shakespeare's death, the British Empire rose and fell, and various waves of scholarship revised each other. And yet the counterfactual myth of an Adamic Shakespeare still needs to be noticed and resisted, and probably always will. For some time now, Dr. Alexa Alice Joubin, whom I am lucky to call my friend, has pioneered a conception of Shakespeare, especially in reference to Asia, that eludes the centrality of empire in the conception of Shakespeare's appropriations. One of the concepts from her work that first affected mine was her influential conception of localities. And now with the present volume, she has charted paths that offer new and inventive ways of understanding how adaptive drama can be hybridized, mediated, and contested in the burgeoning creativity of East Asia. Her work includes and also goes beyond contestations of value and power, and she has argued with particular clarity for critical consideration of how Anglo-centered criticism can persistently fetishize, artificially categorize, and critically retranslate Asian iterations of Shakespeare. Two things in particular are salient concepts that will change how we work with Shakespeare as a result of this book. One is the reconception of national boundaries Joubin articulates, perhaps because of academic departmentalization, or simply because most scholars tend to feel confident in one or two languages and one or two theatrical traditions. Most study of appropriation has focused on particular nations as they respond to Shakespeare. So we have Shakespeare in Japan, Shakespeare in Vietnam, Shakespeare in India, and rarely do we see an attempt to bridge national responses, which I think is profoundly useful and needed. Our tendency toward limited macro responses, that is, how does India view Shakespeare, shapes our tendency toward limited micro responses. If we only read Japanese Shakespeare as responding to England or to Kurosawa, then we also are prone to only reading Lady Macbeth as contesting the gender roles of her culture, and we tend to overlook the ways in which she may be challenging her husband's conception of gender roles in specific scenes. The problem with that is that it reduces a complex, multifocal creative field into a series of Anglophone speeches and global responses. Joubin is much more interested in ways in which different Asian creators speak in conversation with each other. The English language and the words of Shakespeare enter the playing field, as we saw in that clip, but not as fundamentally distinct from various other local patterns of speech, movement, gender codes, and authority. This is particularly apparent in the language of gender, which operates linguistically in highly contingent ways, sometimes needing a pronoun, sometimes not, and which must be embodied in order for drama to happen. Her examples richly illustrate how stereotypes and parodies intersect with renditions of Shakespeare in such a way that it is a considerable challenge and a delightful one to figure out what is going on. National boundaries matter, but they cannot be permitted to dominate our conversation about how such genres mutate and comment on one another. The Let me just scroll up. Okay. The other feature of this work that is certain to alter conversations in the field is her notion of compulsory realpolitik. That phrase is important because, of course, a stage director or filmmaker in South Korea may choose to comment on the division in the Korean peninsula through a staging of King Lear, a play in which a senile king divides his island. But that should be a choice. It is problematic when a Western reading of any Korean adaptation of King Lear is automatically translated into a reading that takes Lear's division to be the meaning that underlies or underwrites an assumed reading of the Cold War. Such a critical insistence on reducing meaning to something that shows up in Western news websites and cultural memory denies cultural agency to the Asian creator. It also promotes a model of linguistic interchange that is fundamentally ethnocentric. England creates, South Korea applies, and England interprets. Such a dyadic paradigm admits no room for speech outside of that narrow path, room that our current events emphasize we sorely need. No room is permitted for any response in excess of what is specifically marked and as holding meaning in that dyadic relationship. Anything else is stigmatized as being local, responsive, or testimonial. So with all of that appreciation for the book in mind, I'd like to move to my question for Alexa, which is post-pandemic, we're emerging into a sense of social space again. Our sense of personal space is surely going to change. Do you think that this may inspire a renewed interest in traditional theatrical modes?
In a large part of the US, UK, Europe, Canada, live theater was shut down for more than a year. When life resumes, I think there will be a rush to any form of live performance. But I think hybridity will be the key going forward. The Royal Shakespeare Company, they did a interactive digital performance, which I was fortunate enough to attend in March. It's called Dream. It's a 1 hour musical theater inspired by A Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's not really linear storytelling. And for audiences who bought interactive tickets using their computer with their mouse, they could throw in fairy dust. They could interact with the character. The actors instruct for upon Avon wearing the motion capture on their bodies. They can interact with your pointer, with whatever you throw in the scene live, and everyone is there to witness this through their computer screen. So going forward, I suspect some form of that would continue, because it has now been proven that this increases the visibility of an theater company. The London Globe, for example, one of the few companies that are self-sustaining without public funding, even before the pandemic, they opened up a lot of their shows during the pandemic, and they cited the large number of visitors as evidence as they asked for government support during the pandemic. There are many other instances, and in some cases, the National Theatre's Coriolanus, starring Thomas Hiddleston, for example, had hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And that number far exceeds what would have been possible within the same 1 week span, right? If you count the number of seats at the National Theatre in London, you realize at most it's 2,400, and there's no way they could have reached the hundreds of thousands of audiences, no matter what they do. And so that's definitely another venue, I think, also a revenue stream. Now, how would this change performance culture? I would think there would be less distinction between the so-called cinematic mode and theatrical mode, because theater is now almost by default, in a hybrid sense, digital and cinematic. This was already a trend before the pandemic. You could go to your local cinema to see a stage play streamed to you, sometimes live, sometimes pre-recorded, right? So that's already taking place. The pandemic merely accelerated this form of organization. Of course, there's huge inequality, access to internet, your speed, and the pandemic has exacerbated that. But these gaps did exist even before, right? But the pandemic, I think, has shown the world that there is a new definition of liveness. What do we regard it as live? It used to be, you would be live, meaning synchronous. So it's a temporal notion, but also spatial. You would be in the same space, breathing the same air, and therefore it is live. However, we don't question cinema. Cinema is live. The film is a highly editorialized product, like a book. It's fixed. In post-production, a lot of work goes into that process, and then it's fixed, like a book. You open a book, you buy 10 copies of the same book, they all read the same. That is what film is. Live theater has the allure of uncertainty, of contingency. Each time might be slightly different. Maybe there will be a glitch, and that's what makes it so ephemeral but interesting. And yet, going forward, I think the definition of live has profoundly changed. We are now live, right, on Zoom, but by that we merely meant temporally. We're synchronous. We're not in the same physical space. So all of this might make, especially productions from what was previously considered far-flung corners of the globe, say some corner of Asia, more accessible, as companies are more open now to share their work. Previously, there's always this anxiety about what if their videos were to leak and people would not come to their theater anymore. I think the pandemic has shown the opposite. But that's a great question. I also wanted to say a few things very briefly to something you mentioned, namely the organizational principle. It was challenging, but also rewarding to write a book that covers an entire region and rather than just one culture. And so obviously, like many authors, I was considering how would we organize the material? There's so much on the table. Do we do it thematically, by director, by region, God forbid, because that might play into some kind of Cold War speech. So I came up with the idea of themes, and it's kind of a series of concentric circles, starting with chapter 1 on sound and spectacle, basically new ways to listen to theater and to watch films. Drawing on Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze, but also other prevalent theories about the idea of the sound and the absence of it. I read only 2 directors, Akira Kurosawa in film and Yukio Ninagawa on stage. From there, we move on from formalistic issues, we moved on to ideological issues, and I've observed in the Sinophone world in the 2nd chapter, politics of remediation, this belief that performing the classics can make you a better person or improve the social condition, or perhaps improve the situation of your theater, some form of dying art, for example, that can revive it. But there are also examples that they highlight tonight, all those parodies, so they don't agree with this political remediation. From there, we move on to the next concentric circle in chapter 3. It's about reception. So I can see we move from formalistic issues to more and more meta issues, and eventually multilingualism, diaspora. How do all these works move around? So I do cover Asian American theater, for example, as well as British Asian theater. So it's not just works that specifically are located or originated from East Asia. I have a special feature that I have an alternative table of contents. So a second table of contents that organize the material slightly differently. For example, it tells you that in the first chapter, there's only one play at the core, that's Macbeth. I wanted to reduce the number of variables to make it more reader-friendly. And you can learn about which media and genres are covered in that particular chapter, and so on. So that's just a different way to think through this material. I'm going to stop here. I see questions coming in. Thank you.
Yes, all right. So if you don't mind, Alexa, let's move on to some of the questions. One viewer writes in from China asking about Kunqu, right? The traditional theater of South Central China, and suggests that this is a form of theater that is too aesthetic and has little political realistic significance. May I kindly ask your opinion, says this viewer, in balancing politics in producing a play? What do you think?
Thank you, Han. Thank you, Dr. Wang Huimin. Political or not? That's such a good question. I understand where your question comes from exactly, because within China, within Taiwan, a lot of criticism of Kunqu is that it has been full of aesthetics. There have been a production, for example, a very high-profile production of Tang Xianzu's Peony Pavilion. He spent 2 days because he tried to perform every single one of the 50 acts by Chen Shizhen in Paris and the Lincoln Center in New York. And that was an attempt to perhaps, if you will, de-aestheticize. But I think it's actually a misconception to say a theater form. It is so focused on aesthetics rather than the politics. Perhaps it is simply how contemporary Kunqu fans, as well as Kunqu theater companies, the contemporary Kunqu movement in Taiwan, for example, is led by the novelist Bai Xianyong. And he's not just a queer novelist, but actually very dedicated to the cause of preservation and revival of Kunqu. And so the literature comes out of a limited number of people who are very focused on quote unquote the beauty of it. So as an aesthetic experience. That doesn't mean that the Kunqu as an art form should be appreciated solely based on its aesthetic value. For example, its use of classical Chinese lyrics. My observation was more meta. I was responding to primarily Western critics who approach this topic. And what do they do with this material? So perhaps opposite of the case of Kunqu, there has been over-politicization of Shakespeare adaptations. When it comes to adaptations of such a canonical figure, and if the adaptation comes now from outside of the axis of Canada, US, UK, there's very often a focus on their political value. Perhaps it's created by dissidents. And you can definitely see that during the 2012 London Olympics, they had a cultural festival to go with it, World Shakespeare Festival. And they invited, I quote, productions from war zone to the carnival zone. So they have groups who rehearse the comedy of errors, for example, during the war in Afghanistan, and finally they made it to the globe. It's a bit of a kind of pilgrimage narrative and how Shakespeare saves us all. And certainly political stories of political oppression should be told. But I think it's a misconception or perhaps a misunderstanding that non-Western arts will only become notable and precisely in chapter 1, I was diverting attention to the innovations by classic masters such as Kurosawa, such as Minagawa, and even how the subtitles gloss over the really interesting work that a film like Throne of Blood is doing regarding gender identities, right? All the different gender pronouns, and when they come through in English, it's just I. It didn't say what kind of I. So that's, I think, it's useful work to engage in.
Yes, we do. And I would agree with you that very often these very reductive political interpretations simply reflect the fact that the interpreter knows only one thing about the country from which the adaptation is coming and isn't listening to that culture very carefully. That's my editorial opinion. Sorry, couldn't repress it. From Jeffrey Gore, we have a question that is somewhat complex and introduces secondary scholarship, so I'm going to cut radically because our time is short. It's about forms of remediation and adaptation. And the bottom line of the question is, in sum, do you approach artistic appropriations as forms of remediation or under a different category?
Thank you, Haun, for the very helpful redaction. I try to read as I speak, obviously. There's limit to multitasking. Yeah. Adaptations, are they artistic remediation? Yes, to some extent, right? We understand the word remediation or kind of the reparative value of adaptation in multiple senses. First of all, it could be reparative. In the case of reviving an art form, of injecting breath of life into an art form. In some other cases, it could be expanding its purview. Take Kunqu theater, for example, right? When it encounters Shakespeare, the actors and directors, they've learned to look at characterization from a different angle. It's not about which one is superior, but just an expanded worldview, whether you do the immersive method or the Alexander method, the performance technique, whether it's from inside out, you first becoming the character, or from the outside in, right? Typically, Asian style theaters, including Chinese Shichi opera and the Japanese no and kabuki, they tend to focus a lot on stylization. Once you master the techniques, you will have in interiority, in internal psychological depth. So it's simply a different approach. And when they encounter Greek tragedy or Shakespeare, the vistas opened up. And it's often helpful. We have actually seen European avant-garde directors like Artyom Monushkin who have turned to Asian forms of expression for precisely this purpose, not to master or master the Chinese opera, but rather simply to, in terms of actors' physical training, to expand the horizon. So in that regard, you might say, yes, it's remediative, it's a form of remediation. Whether it is politically reparative. Well, today, if you look at theater and the film industry, political reparation, social reparation is understood in the sense of social justice. Do we have diverse cast? Do we portray an important issue in a progressive and inclusive manner, right? Films after Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements, they would look quite different compared to films from the 1990s. And so in that sense, yes, it could be social reparative, but in some cases observed, it's kind of more narrow, and that might be problematic. It's quite simplistic, 19th century in a sense of following the footsteps of someone like Matthew Arnold, who said Shakespeare represents the best that is out there that can be said in that sense. So just merely by doing Shakespeare, it ameliorates your conditions, makes you a better person. And we've seen multiple productions and films that lampoon that concept, really parody it. In the West, Kenneth Branagh is one of those who are serious. He has a little film, it's not really well known, Winter's Tale. It's meta-theatrical. It follows a group of bumbling actors who really tried really hard to put on Hamlet. Eventually, the denouement of the film, like many of these reparative films, they succeed in a high-stake performance. So in that sense, I would say adaptations, if it's conceived to be reparative in that narrow sense, it's more problematic and it's quite a shame because there's a lot of work adaptations can do. But if it's based on admiration or reaffirmation of a particular canon, then it's not really achieving much. It's simply giving you yet another iteration of a story you're already familiar with.
Great, thank you. Another question has come in from Jirie Lee. It's short, so I'll just read it out. I would also appreciate if you could explain a bit more about your claim, non-white authors compelled to give their works ethnic meanings. If these tendencies exist, where do you think they are from? And how do you think they are received in adapted environment by new groups of audience?
Thank you, thank you. Where does it come from? In short, from critical literature, from histories that are available to us out there about performance, about adaptations. There's the implicit understanding of what constitutes the mainstream, or quote unquote the pure Shakespeare studies, which is always historically located in the early modern, in the 16th and 17th century. Any trans-historical work to make a bridge between the early modern and the modern times would be seen as more of secondary interest. I'm sure Michael can address that as well, or the study of translations. So there's a pervasive whiteness, and that has nothing to do with the identity of the researchers. It's pervasive whiteness in the field that very often considers non-white authors, non-white artists, in terms of the ethnic meanings of their works. And this is part of the compulsory realpolitik when they see a work on tour, for example. And if they happen to know its point of origin, oh, this is a South Korean company, they would try to map it onto, for example, the politics of the Korean Peninsula, and I've witnessed this in interviews at Edinburgh International Festival. The South Korean director specifically pushed back several times in saying that actually he just wanted to be playful with a play like The Tempest. He really doesn't have politics in mind. He doesn't want the narrow interpretation of political allegory. And yet Western reviewers disregard that and just kind of step over him, right? And continue to use geopolitics, or what they understood as kind of the area studies models, to interpret that South Korean Tempest. And that's when it becomes problematic. So the tendency really exists among journalists, among reviewers, but also among academics. And that pervasive whiteness, I will emphasize again, it's not really about the identities of the person making those statements, right? Sometimes Asian directors, they inadvertently subscribe to that too themselves, because they think that is the selling point. There are directors who actively resist that, which I think is understandable, because as artists, it's really, I understand why artists have an ego, because it's their brand name. They want you to look at them. Don't look at South Korea, can you look at me? This is my innovation, so it's my name, my brand name. And there's a lot of pushback along those lines, but that's universal, right? You go to any artist, if you talk to them at length about how they represent a particular culture, it gets boring really fast. But if you talk about their art and their performance, the unique approach, how they are different from everyone else, then they get really interested.
Yeah, Alexa, I was hoping I might ask a question following on that a little bit. I was provoked by the slide in which you said in which you gave the comment that the question was just asking, because in it you had 3 or 4 statements that were what I call the generalized passive, right? A statement in the passive voice that attributes very vague agency to the world or the universe or something for a certain state of affairs. I think it's always helpful to say, who said that? Why did they say it? When did they say it? So let me shake a finger at you for that. But I want you to have a chance to attribute some acts to agents by talking a little bit about the fact of the creativity and agency of the people who are making these adaptations, right? These are by no means obedient adaptations. Kurosawa, for example, when he takes Shakespeare, he invents new plots and new characters. When you read the scripts of Kurosawa's Lear, for example, Ran, you find that there's only a small percentage of lines that correspond to lines in the Shakespeare script. He and his scriptwriter sat down and re-motivated every moment of the story that they were telling, which is, you know, it's what we call adaptation. One thing I love about this is the fact that Shakespeare was doing exactly that in his theater, right? He was taking stories from Greece and Rome and Denmark and, you know, whatever. He would have taken stories from China if he had had them and converting them into something new that his London audience wanted to see. So against the Matthew Arnold essentialist notion of a pure Shakespeare who is Englishness on a pedestal, I think we want to bring up the other Shakespeare, the Shakespeare of Keats and Coleridge and Emerson and Wilde and Borges, right? A Shakespeare who is totally about flexibility, in which characters morph in the course of a play. Human relations change entirely. And so here's the burden of my question. All that was scene setting. We're not just talking about adaptation of Western drama on Asian stages. We're talking about Shakespeare. How can you see the fact of these adaptations involving Shakespeare, this extraordinarily fluid author who's welcoming to a kind of indeterminacy and experimental sensibility as being the object of these adaptations? Wouldn't it be awfully different if we were talking about, I don't know, you know, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, Henrik Ibsen, you know, whatever, right? There's no other dramatist in the world, I think, who can completely grant this wish for flexibility in the way that Shakespeare can. That would be my pitch for him anyway, but I don't know how you see it.
Thank you. Yes, I think Shakespeare does have a unique place in the world compared to, say, Ibsen or Arthur Miller, and just in terms of the sheer number of adaptations. And very often artists do not approach this material. I think it's very rare in the after 1980s. Approach this material by going to Shakespeare. They actually go to, for example, Kurosawa. Kurosawa has inspired a lot of film adaptations itself, especially Throne of Blood. So it has its own afterlife. I might give a few examples there to further my statement about the deep connections. This is a play, so it's not Macbeth that has this amazing afterlife. It's actually Kurosawa and the legacy of his Throne of Blood. There have been a stage recreation at Oregon Shakespeare Festival recently, so it's performed in English. But when you go to the production, if you've seen the film before, you will say, oh my God, this is simply a stage version of the film, except they speak English. So paying tribute to him, and Shakespeare is no longer the source material. So it's kind of a spiderweb of rhizomatic cross-references, without Shakespeare. Sometimes without Shakespeare at the center, sometimes entirely circumventing the so-called source material. And in Taiwan, Wu Xingguo did the Beijing Opera, was a solo performance, was paying tribute to Kurosawa and also inspired by that film, especially how the general dies a gruesome death in the final scene by all of the arrows being shot at him. There are many other examples. There is actually a kabuki Macbeth, and there had been an Asian American play by John Brigg called Shogun Macbeth. All of these specifically reference Kurosawa. And this phenomenon is quite unique, right? Yes, Shakespeare was there, but not really there because an adaptation begins to have its own afterlife and just overwriting Macbeth and taking over. I think Haun's question is related to Jiray Lee's question here about King and the Clown. That's yet another example. So I read Gong Ji, the trans character, as an Ophelia figure, not because the film maps onto the chronological plot points of Hamlet, but rather a few key motifs. So obviously, Gong Ji is objectified by the male gaze, like Ophelia, as the love interest of the leading male characters, the king and Gong Ji's performance partner, right? This Ophelia is styled by the determining male gaze throughout, but most strikingly, there's a scene in the royal court where Gong Ji wears a Beijing opera headdress in a protracted play within the film scene, and the flowers on their head really calls to mind not only Ophelia's garland, and the flowers she picks, but also the figure of the androgynous flower boys in Korea, right? And there's also an attempted suicide by Gong Ji, and Gong Ji almost drowns in their own blood. So unlike Ophelia in a stream, here it's the blood, and the characters discover in time to have their life saved. All of these are examples of how we could read. Of course, that's not only reading possible. We could read this character as an Ophelia figure. I've encountered this question several times, and it's not really about is this 50% match, 70% match, does it match? And does it count as Shakespeare? But rather, I'm just looking at the echoes. I do have another examples of King Lear, for example, such an important role in East Asian performances, not just because of the new theme the artist gave it, filial piety, or generational gap, but rather there's this uncanny. I'll tell you a story of this Korean shaman. If you happen to know King Lear, you would think I'm telling the story of Korean version of Lear, but I'm not. So an Asian couple, of course, in their 3 daughters, one by one, yes, 3 daughters, and the writer, obviously from 17th century, did not read King Lear, and asked the daughters, to whom they owe their good fortune. The first and second daughters answer that they owe their happiness to their parents. You know, the right answer pleases them. The third daughter, however, is more honest and says that they owe their good fortune to the heaven. That this pleases her parents. They disown her, they throw her out of the family, until one day the parents trip on the door sill and lose their eyesight in the fall. So they're reduced to beggars, and then they got reunited with the youngest daughter in the marketplace, who's actually setting up a feast for beggars. Ever so saintly, she, of course, like Cordelia, forgives. She's the unlikely heroine, right? Forgives their parents. And so I've seen performances that merge this shaman legend with King Lear, and it has this uncanny polyphonic echoes all at once of all of these sources. It's really an adaptation of the shaman narrative and a bit of King Lear. It's simply a new work, so it's not linear, I guess. And you're right about the agency. I don't think adoration is an issue anymore, or fidelity. Perhaps it is in some corners of the academia, but for practicing artists, they really care more about their own brand, right? And they care about the creativity, what interesting work they can do with some materials. It's not about this Shakespeare on a pedestal, we have to do him justice by performing this particular work.
Thank you very much, Alexa. Thank you, Michael, for a tremendously lively discussion of an important and very innovative book. It's time to wrap up. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program, which is part of the East Asia by the Book series of author talks sponsored by the Center for East Asian Studies in partnership with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. The center has hosted already a number of book talks this academic year, and if you missed them, it's not serious. You can find them recorded on our YouTube channel. We'll have a link in the chat box shortly for your reference. While the academic year is winding down here at Chicago, the center is anticipating a very robust year of activities starting in the fall. There will be more scheduled book talks, there will be invited speakers, colloquia, all kinds of things held in person and distributed by the web. Please subscribe so that you can stay abreast of these events, and we look forward to having you join us. Until then, I wish you a wonderful rest of the evening, and I would like to applaud once more our brilliant speakers.
Thank you again, Haun. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, the Center for East Asian Studies, for hosting this. You all have a wonderful evening.
All right, good night.
Right.